"Don't stand near the coffin." Those were the words my son, Mark, spat at me as the church bells tolled and the crowd shifted in their pews. It was my husband's funeral, a man I had spent 50 years beside, and yet my own flesh and blood ordered me to step back as though I were an intruder. People gasped, some turned away in discomfort, and I felt a wave of eyes pressing down on me, as if waiting to see whether I would obey. My name is Evelyn Grant. I am 76 years old, a retired high school teacher who spent her life shaping young minds in our small Ohio town. I am a widow now, but for decades I balanced lesson plans with laundry loads, grading papers with family dinners, always believing that hard work and devotion would anchor me in the respect of my family. And yet, in that church, I was treated not as a wife or a mother, but as a problem to be hidden. Mark, my eldest at 52, stood tall by the casket, his suit perfectly tailored, his jaw tight, his voice carrying with a kind of authority that silenced even Pastor John, the minister who had known our family for years. Mark had grown into a businessman with ambitions in local politics, admired by many for his sharp mind and confidence. But in that moment, the mask slipped. His command was not for dignity, it was for domination. Rebecca, his wife of 20 years, sat in the front pew, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Rebecca had a way of looking polished, no matter the circumstance, her presence carefully calculated. I noticed the faint curve of satisfaction in her lips as I hesitated. She didn't need to say a word. Her approval of Mark's cruelty was evident. I stood frozen, my palms trembling against the fabric of my black dress. The coffin lay just feet away, mahogany polished to a shine, flowers framing the lid. My husband had loved lilies. I had chosen those flowers, yet at that moment, it seemed even that detail no longer belonged to me. Pastor John cleared his throat, perhaps hoping to smooth the tension, but Mark's eyes never left mine. Cold, unyielding, he leaned closer, his whisper sharp enough for me alone. "Stay back. This is about Dad, not you." I obeyed, because defiance in that instant would have caused a scene, and I had not yet gathered the strength for battle. Instead, I retreated to a pew at the side, my body rigid, my heart pounding against my ribs. I sat alone, the space beside me empty, the distance a wall built not of wood and stone but of rejection and humiliation. Linda, my daughter of 48, arrived late, slipping into the pew across the aisle. She avoided my eyes, her movements careful, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought she might come to my side, but she remained still, glancing only toward Mark and Rebecca, as though seeking silent approval. When Pastor John began his eulogy, the words were meant to honor my husband's life, his years in the community, his devotion to family, his role as a guiding figure. Yet I listened with a tightening in my chest, because something was missing. My name, my presence, my place in his story. John's words had been provided by Mark. I realized, the script already written without me. My husband's life, retold, without the woman who had shared every dawn and dusk of it. As the choir sang, I thought back to my early years of marriage. My husband and I had bought our modest home in town with savings scraped from long days and longer nights. I taught history. He worked at the local plant. Together, we built stability, raised children, and believed our sacrifices would one day be honored. To be erased in this moment felt like a betrayal, not just by Mark, but by the man lying in that coffin, silent now and unable or unwilling to defend me. When the time came for family members to speak, I rose, intending to share a memory, perhaps a small story that would remind people who I had been in my husband's life. But Mark stepped forward, blocking the microphone with his arm. "Not today, Mother," he said, his voice low but firm. The congregation shifted uncomfortably. Some looked at their shoes, others at the ceiling, unwilling to meet my gaze. Rebecca leaned closer to him, whispering, and he nodded. Then he turned to the crowd and announced, "I'll speak on behalf of the family." On behalf of the family, as though I were not part of it. I sat down, my knees weak, the humiliation sharp enough to burn. I saw Linda glance in my direction, a flicker of conflict crossing her face, but she remained where she was. Not a word, not a gesture of comfort. Her silence hurt more than Mark's words, for it confirmed the isolation he intended for me. Mark's speech painted a picture of a man larger than life, a pillar of strength, a builder of legacy. He spoke of discipline, sacrifice, and vision, each phrase rehearsed and polished. Yet in the narrative he spun, My husband appeared to have stood alone, a solitary hero. I was absent, as though my 50 years beside him had been erased by the stroke of Mark's tongue. The congregation applauded softly, their sympathy directed toward Mark, the grieving son, the man who carried himself with authority and sorrow. No one noticed me, the widow seated alone, her grief overshadowed by the spectacle of control. When the service ended, people filed past the coffin, offering condolences. Some shook Mark's hand, others touched Rebecca's shoulder. A few offered polite nods in my direction, but no one lingered. I was background, a shadow in the corner of the narrative my own son had constructed. As I stepped forward to lay my hand on the coffin, to whisper my final goodbye, Mark's arm shot out once. More, I said. Don't, he muttered, his grip firm on my wrist. I looked into his eyes, searching for the boy I had once raised, the boy who had clung to my skirt when frightened, who had wept in my arms after scraped knees and broken toys. But that boy was gone. All that remained was a man who saw me not as a mother, but as an obstacle to his version of truth. I withdrew my hand, not because I wanted to, but because I knew the moment for confrontation had not yet come. My breath caught in my throat as I turned away, walking slowly toward the exit while whispers followed me. Outside, the sky was gray, heavy with clouds. The wind tugged at the edges of my coat as I stood on the church steps, staring at the town that had been my home for decades. In that instant, I realized this was not just grief. This was the beginning of something darker. Because it wasn't enough for Mark to control a funeral. He wanted to control the story of my life, my husband's life, our family's legacy. And I, Evelyn Grant, widow, teacher, mother, would have to decide whether I would let him erase me or whether I would find my voice, no matter how late in life, and speak so loudly the whole town could not ignore me. I stood there as the mourners filed out, my eyes lingering on the stained glass windows of the church. Inside, my husband lay in silence, surrounded by words and images I no longer recognized. But outside, I felt the stirrings of something that had been buried within me for years. Not rage, not bitterness, resolve. For the first time in a long time, I understood that silence had been my undoing. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was time to break it. The morning after the funeral, I opened the local newspaper expecting to see a respectful tribute to my husband. Instead, I saw his name stretched across the headline, his accomplishments listed line by line, but nowhere in that article did I exist. It said he was survived by his children, Mark and Linda, and their families. I read the line twice, my eyes burning, my chest tight. My name had been cut from the record, as if the 50 years of my marriage had never been. I folded the paper slowly, my hands stiff. That kind of erasure was not an accident. It was deliberate, calculated. I thought of Mark's sharp whisper at the funeral and Rebecca's satisfied expression. I had been silenced in front of the congregation, and now I was erased on paper. The two moments connected like matching stones in a wall. Later that day, Linda came to the house. She walked in carrying a casserole, her hair pulled back neatly, her eyes darting around as if to avoid mine. She was my daughter, but she had always been careful. The kind who chose her words like coins, never giving more than necessary. She set the dish on the counter and finally looked at me. "It was a beautiful service, wasn't it?" she asked, her voice even, her smile forced. I wanted to ask why she hadn't stepped in, why she had stayed silent while her brother told me to move away from the coffin. But I only said, "You saw the obituary." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes, I know, it didn't mention you." "It didn't mention me," I repeated, the words dry in my throat. "And you let it happen." She flinched, but did not deny it. Instead she said, "Mark thought it would keep things simple. People remember Dad as a leader, a man who stood on his own. It plays better that way, plays better, as if a funeral were a performance, and my role had been cut from the script." I stared at my daughter, and for the first time I saw not the child I had held through storms and heartbreaks, but a woman who had chosen comfort over truth. Her silence at the service had not been hesitation, it had been consent. Later, as I cleared the kitchen, I noticed Rebecca's signature on the condolence cards, stacked neatly on the table. Rebecca had always been the strategist, the one who shaped Mark's speeches and polished his image. Now she was polishing history, sanding off the parts that did not fit. That evening, I turned on the television. A local news segment showed highlights from the funeral. The footage included Mark at the microphone, his voice strong, his words painting my husband as a solitary hero. The camera panned across the front pews where Rebecca sat gracefully, her expression dignified. When the shot reached me though, I realized something startling. I wasn't there. The angle had been edited, cropped carefully so that the space where I had sat alone on the side was out of frame. Even the camera had joined the conspiracy. I switched the television off, my reflection staring back at me in the dark screen. My presence was being erased, in every form, spoken, printed, and filmed. I had always believed that dignity came from patience and quiet endurance. Now that patience was being weaponized against me. A few days later, Mark arrived. He didn't knock. He walked in like the house already belonged to him. His voice carried the confidence of a man who expected no resistance. "Mom, we're organizing Dad's archives," he said. "Photos, documents, school records, everything will be cataloged." "Rebecca's handling the digital side," I asked. "And what about me?" He smiled, the kind of smile meant to soften bad news, but only sharpened it. "We'll make sure you're taken care of. You don't need to worry about the details." I did not press him then, but when he left, I opened the closet where I had stored boxes of family photographs. Several were missing. I searched the shelves, pulling down old albums, and found gaps where memories had been. I knew, without question, who had taken them. Rebecca visited the next morning, uninvited. She spoke with practiced ease, complimenting the flowers in the yard, admiring the china on the shelves. Then, as if slipping it in casually, she said, "Mark and I are putting together a memorial video for your husband. We want to celebrate his legacy, show the community what kind of man he was." I asked, "Will I be in it?" Her smile never faltered. "We're focusing on his story, you know, the public side of him." The answer was clear. My image was being erased not only from the obituary but from the entire narrative of his life. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room, surrounded by albums and loose photographs. Some showed me holding my children, others captured holidays, graduations, dinners where I had cooked until my hands ached. Each picture was a piece of proof that I had been there, that my life had meaning beyond the margins of someone else's speech. As I flipped through one album, I found an empty space where a photo had been removed. The outline of it remained, a pale rectangle against the darker page. That absence was louder than any word. Someone had reached into the book and plucked me from history. The following afternoon, Pastor John stopped by. He carried a folder of church documents, offering condolences once more. He was kind, his voice steady, his eyes compassionate. But when he mentioned how moving Mark's eulogy had been, I felt the sting again. Even John, who had known me for decades, had accepted the story without question. I wanted to ask him why my name had been left out, why my presence had been diminished, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I thanked him politely and watched him leave, his footsteps fading on the sidewalk. In the days that followed, I noticed whispers in the grocery store, polite smiles that did not reach the eyes. People were beginning to talk. They were repeating Mark's words, Rebecca's version, Linda's silence. My absence was becoming the accepted truth. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the missing photographs, the folded newspaper, the blank space where my husband's name now stood alone, and I understood something I had not wanted to face. This was not a mistake. This was not carelessness. This was deliberate. My children, my own blood, were building a story in which I had never truly existed, and unless I found a way to fight back, they would succeed. I first noticed the shift when I walked into my living room and found David hunched over his laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting off his glasses. My grandson had come to check on me, or so he said, but what caught my eye was the image on the screen. It was a draft of the memorial video Mark and Rebecca had been preparing. David froze when he saw me, his fingers pausing over the keyboard. He tried to close the window quickly, but not before I saw what had been done. The slideshow showed our family across the years, school graduations, birthdays, anniversaries, yet in every frame where I should have been standing beside my husband, beside my children, beside my students, I was missing, cropped out, smudged away. In one photograph where I remembered holding the cake at Mark's 10th birthday, the image had been carefully altered so that the cake floated on the table alone. Mark blowing out the candles with his father standing proudly behind him. No mother in sight. I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, "Play it." David hesitated. "Grandma, it's not finished." I wasn't supposed to play it. He obeyed. The video rolled on. a sequence of smiling faces and milestones. But in every picture, I had been stripped out, as though my presence had been a stain on the canvas of their perfect narrative. At the end, a caption faded onto the screen, a legacy built by one man. My throat tightened, but I refused to let him see me tremble. When the video stopped, I asked, "Who made this?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, Rebecca. They've been working with a company. They said it was better to focus on Grandpa. Cleaner, simpler, cleaner, simpler." The words felt like acid. David looked ashamed, his eyes darting away. "I didn't know they were taking you out until I saw the files. I thought maybe it was an accident, but it's not. They've been doing it on purpose." I placed a hand on the back of his chair, steadying myself. "And you didn't stop them?" His silence was answer enough. That evening, when the house was quiet, I opened the box of photographs Mark had taken from me and managed to slip back into the house. They were not where I had left them. Several albums had been stripped of pages, the photos replaced with duplicates that excluded me. In one family portrait, my chair was empty, my face gone. The digital copies Rebecca had produced were now the official record, leaving my originals discarded like trash. I went to Linda the next day. She met me at a cafe on Main Street, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup. I laid one of the altered photographs on the table between us. "Do you see this?" I asked. She nodded slowly, her jaw tense. "That was my place, my chair, my family, and now it's empty. Do you know who did this?" Her eyes flickered with something, guilt, maybe, or fear, but her words were measured. "Mom, Mark is just trying to protect Dad's memory. He thinks people respond better when the story is simple. He believes it's better for the community." "Better for the community," I repeated, the bitterness catching in my throat. "And what about me? 50 years of my life, do I belong to this community or not?" She lowered her gaze, and I knew then that she had chosen her side. She didn't argue, she didn't comfort, she didn't resist. She just let the silence stretch, and that silence told me everything. That night, I sat in the dark with the altered photographs spread out before me. Each one was like a wound, a piece of myself cut away. I could almost hear Rebecca's smooth voice in every cropped edge, every manipulated image. "You don't belong here. You never did." When David came again, he found me at the table, the photographs scattered like debris. He stood in the doorway, his face pale. "I don't agree with what they're doing," he said quietly. "But Dad, he won't listen to me. He says you're making this harder than it has to be." "Do you believe him?" I asked. David's mouth opened, then closed. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His loyalty was torn, his heart split between his father and me, but his silence weighed heavier than any words. In the following days, invitations began to circulate around town for a legacy exhibit honoring my husband. Posters appeared in shop windows, flyers were slipped into mailboxes, all featuring Mark's face alongside my husband's, with Rebecca's signature design polish. The slogan read, "One man's vision, one family's pride, one man, not two, not one couple, not one family in truth, just one man." I walked past the poster outside the library, and for the first time, people avoided meeting my eyes. They had seen the advertisements, heard the speeches, watched the edited footage. They believed the story Mark and Rebecca had crafted. And in their eyes, I was an extra, a bystander, not the woman who had shared the burdens, the sacrifices, the endless nights of work. At church the following Sunday, Pastor John spoke kindly about the exhibit. He praised Mark for carrying on his father's legacy, thanked Rebecca for her efforts, and expressed pride in the family. Not once did my name leave his lips. He had known me for decades, baptized my children, buried my husband. Yet now, he repeated their version as though it were truth. After the service, I cornered him. "Do you believe all this?" I asked. He looked startled. "Evelyn, I only repeated what I was told. Mark's done so much for the town. He wants to honor his father." And erased his mother. I said. Pastor John didn't reply. He simply adjusted his collar and excused himself, leaving me standing in the church hallway, surrounded by parishioners who whispered and moved past as though I were invisible. When I returned home, I locked the door and sat in the silence. The walls of my house felt foreign, as though they were closing in on me. I pulled out one last album from the bottom of the closet, a book I had hidden away years ago. Inside were pictures too old for Rebecca to have touched yet. Pictures of me with my husband when we were young, our children still small, our smiles genuine. proof that I had lived this life, that I had been there at every step. I traced my finger over one photograph of Mark sitting on my lap, his hair tousled, his eyes wide with trust. He had once looked at me as if I were the center of his world. Now he was rewriting that world without me. I closed the album, my decision hardening with every beat of my heart. They could crop me out of their videos. They could rewrite their speeches. They could paste posters across town. But I knew the truth, and the truth still lived in me. They had started a war not over money, not over property, but over memory itself, and I was not going to surrender. The invitations arrived in thick envelopes, the kind used for weddings or charity galas. Inside was an embossed card announcing the launch of the Legacy exhibit at the town hall. My husband's name was in gold, bold letters across the top, followed by a line that made my stomach tighten. A vision preserved by his son. There was no mention of me. Not a single word about the decades we had spent side by side. Linda came by that afternoon. She held her invitation loosely, as if it burned her fingers. She spoke quickly, avoiding my eyes. It's important for the town. Mom, Dad's story deserves to be told. Mark has put so much into this. And you? I asked, my voice steady. What have you put into it? She hesitated, then slid a folder across the table. Inside were release forms, legal documents, giving permission for the family's likeness and memories to be used in promotional material. My name had already been signed. I stared at the signature, perfectly forged, my handwriting mimicked so carefully it could have fooled anyone but me. Why? I whispered. Linda folded her hands tightly. It keeps things clean. Less confusion. You don't have to be dragged into every detail. I pushed the papers back toward her. That's my name, that's my life, and you let him erase it with a pen. She didn't respond. She sat still, her shoulders stiff, her eyes wet but unyielding. I realized then that her silence was not weakness but choice. She had chosen her side, even if it meant betraying me. Later that evening, I went into town to see the posters for myself. The exhibit was being advertised everywhere, on the library bulletin board, in the bakery window, even on the notice board at the school where I had once taught. My husband's face stared back at me from every surface, proud and alone. Below him, Mark's name appeared in bold letters as the curator of Legacy. Rebecca's design was unmistakable. Sleek lines, perfect balance, a story polished until it gleamed. And still, I was nowhere. I overheard two women in the bakery line talking about it. What a remarkable man he was, one said. Raised those children practically on his own. The other nodded. Mark really takes after him. Such strength, such vision. Their words stabbed deeper than I expected. It wasn't just my children rewriting the story. The town was beginning to believe it. That weekend, David stopped by again. His face was pale, his expression drawn. Grandma, he said quietly, Dad asked me to help with the exhibit. I thought maybe I could put in some of your things, but when I mentioned it, he shut me down. He said it would confuse the narrative. Confuse? I asked. I am the narrative. David shifted, uncomfortable. They're telling people Grandpa did everything on his own. They've got old colleagues of his lined up to speak, people from the plant, from the town council. They've even offered stipends to some of your old co-workers to give statements. The room seemed to spin for a moment. Paid, he nodded. They're buying memories, Grandma rewriting them. I sat heavily in my chair, my palms flat against the table. The betrayal was no longer confined to my family. It had spread to the people I had trusted, the community I had served. Colleagues who had once praised my dedication were now being paid to pretend I had been irrelevant. 2 days later, I received a call from a former student, a woman now in her 40s. She sounded hesitant, almost apologetic. Mrs. Grant, she began, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. They asked me to speak at the exhibit. They wanted me to talk about how your husband encouraged us, how he inspired us. But I remember, it was you. You stayed after school, you tutored me for free. Still, they said if I wanted to be part of the program, I had to focus on him, not you. Her voice cracked. I'm sorry. When the line went dead, I sat in the quiet, the phone heavy in my hand. My own student, forced to erase me in order to belong, walked through town the next morning, my head held high even as whispers followed me. I could feel eyes on me, hear the words muttered under breaths. Some said I was bitter, others claimed I was unstable, clinging to a past that was not mine. The narrative Mark and Rebecca had spun was taking root, poisoning the soil I had watered with years of labor. That evening, I confronted Linda again. She came to the house reluctantly, her face pale, her hands fidgeting with her purse strap. "Why, Linda?" I asked. "Why would you let them erase me?" She broke then, her voice trembling. "Because I can't afford to lose what he promised. Mark said he'd make sure I was taken care of, that my kids would have a share in the future. If I fought him, if I sided with you, he'd cut me out. I'm sorry, Mom, I can't risk it." Her words landed heavier than any of Mark's commands. It wasn't just fear or pressure. It was choice. My own daughter had chosen security over truth, inheritance over loyalty. I turned away from her, my hands gripping the counter. I did not let her see my tears. She left quietly, the door clicking shut behind her. When night fell, I went into the living room and gathered the albums, the photographs, the letters that remained untouched. I spread them across the floor, surrounding myself with the evidence of my life. In those images, I saw birthdays I had baked for, graduations I had attended, holidays I had decorated, nights I had stayed awake by the sick bed of children who now turned their backs on me. They could strip my name from the papers, they could crop me from the pictures, they could bribe the community to forget, but I knew I had lived it, and the more they erased, the more determined I became to fight. The week of the exhibit, the town buzzed with excitement. Every street corner seemed to carry my husband's face, every conversation whispered his name. I walked past banners draped across lampposts, each one stamped with slogans Rebecca had surely crafted: strength, vision, legacy. The words cut deep because they stood alone, unattached to the years of partnership, the sacrifices that had made that vision possible. I decided to see the exhibit before the opening. I walked into the town hall when no one was supposed to be there, but the doors were unlocked, the hum of projectors filling the lobby. The main room had been transformed into a shrine. Photographs lined the walls, carefully chosen and enlarged. Displays showed newspaper clippings, awards, artifacts from the plant where he had worked. And in every corner, Mark's fingerprints were evident, his voice shaping the story, his ambition carved into every frame. What struck me first was not my absence, it was the presence of another. In photographs where I remembered standing beside my husband cutting ribbons, attending charity dinners, sitting at the head of the table, there was now another woman, a stranger, smiling faintly. Her image blended so seamlessly, it looked as though she had always been there. I reached out, touched the glossy print, and felt my stomach twist. They hadn't just erased me, they had replaced me. My knees weakened, but I forced myself forward. On the central wall, a timeline stretched across decades. At each milestone, Mark had written captions celebrating his father's determination, his sacrifices, his influence on the community. Beneath one photograph from our 30th anniversary, where I remembered the laughter, the music, the cake I had baked myself, the caption read, "A man who carried his family on his shoulders." No mention of the partner who had stood beside him. I heard voices behind me and ducked into the shadow of a display. Mark walked in with Linda and Rebecca. Their tone was low, conspiratorial, but the words reached me clearly in the empty hall. "Almost ready," Rebecca said, her heels clicking softly. "Once the opening night is done, the press will eat it up. It'll be the perfect launch for your campaign." Mark's voice followed, steady, confident. "This is about Dad's legacy. People want a hero, not complications. That's why we cut her out. It's cleaner." Linda's reply was quieter, uncertain. "She's going to notice. She already knows. She's old," Mark said flatly. "She won't fight. And even if she does, who will believe her over us? The papers, the videos, the community, they all say the same thing now. Truth is what people see, not what they don't." Rebecca laughed softly. "By the time the election comes, she'll be nothing more than a footnote no one remembers." I stood frozen, their words echoing in the chamber built to celebrate a life I had shared but no longer recognized. When they left, I stepped out from the shadows and stared at the exhibits again. The betrayal was no longer hidden. It was displayed under bright lights, polished for public admiration. That evening, I returned home and pulled the remaining albums from the closet. I laid them across the dining table, lining up the originals with the altered versions I had seen at the hall. The contrast was unbearable. In one, I held a newborn Linda in my arms, exhaustion etched in my face but joy in my eyes. In the exhibit's version, only my husband cradled her, strong and composed, while I had vanished entirely. In another, I was shown smiling beside Mark at his graduation, my hand on his shoulder. In their edited print, he stood alone with his father, his mother, a ghost, erased without trace. The next morning, I confronted Linda directly. I went to her house, unannounced. She opened the door, surprise flashing across her features, but she let me in. I set the altered photograph on her kitchen counter. "Is this who you are now?" I asked. She didn't meet my eyes. "It's complicated. It's betrayal." She winced, but her shoulders stiffened. "I didn't make the decisions, I just signed the papers. Mark promised security for my kids. He said if I didn't agree, I'd lose everything. I couldn't risk that. Mom, I can't." Her words landed like blows. My daughter, who I had carried, fed, protected, now spoke to me like I was a stranger, interfering with her comfort. I felt the air leave my lungs, but I steadied myself. "You've sold me out for promises," I said. She finally looked at me then, tears in her eyes, but she didn't argue. She didn't deny it. And her silence was worse than anything she could have said. Back at home, I found the mailbox stuffed with flyers for the exhibit. Each one had the same polished image, the same slogans, the same erasure of me. Neighbors were already talking. At the grocery store, I heard them repeating the lines, praising Mark for honoring his father, calling him the dutiful son. No one questioned why I was missing. To them, the story was already fact. I carried the groceries back to my car and noticed the clerk watching me with something like pity, or maybe suspicion. In that look, I saw the power of what Mark and Rebecca had done. They had not just removed me from pictures, they were reshaping memory itself. That night, I sat with David again. He tried to comfort me, but his words faltered. "Grandma, maybe, if you just let it go, it'll be easier. People like simple stories. They want heroes. Dad gives them that." I stared at him, my heart heavy. "And what do they make of me?" He had no answer. He only looked down at his hands. I rose from the table, gathered the scattered photographs, and placed them back in their boxers. "If they want a hero," I said quietly, "then I will remind them who kept that hero alive." The exhibit would open in days, and when it did, I knew I had to be there, not as a spectator, not as a ghost, but as the woman they were trying to erase. The day nurse, Karen, knocked on my door. I almost didn't answer. By then, I had grown used to the silence of my house, the weight of isolation pressing down until it was easier to stay still than to open myself to another wound. But the knock came again, firm, steady, unwilling to be ignored. When I opened the door, she stood there in her scrubs, her hair pulled back, her face calm but watchful. "I looked after your husband," she said softly, as though she needed to remind me. "There's something I need to give you. Something he left behind." I let her in. She carried a small envelope, worn at the edges. My husband's name scrawled across the front in handwriting I knew by heart. I stared at it but did not reach for it. My hands felt too heavy. Karen set it on the table. "He wrote it near the end. He never mailed it. I thought you should have it." She paused, searching my face. "I don't know if it will comfort you, but it's his truth." When she left, the house felt colder. I sat with the envelope for hours, running my fingers over the ink, afraid of what words might lie inside. Finally, when the sun dipped low and shadows filled the kitchen, I tore it open. The letter was short. My husband had never been one for flourishes. His words were plain, clipped, but heavy with meaning. He wrote of pride in his children, of regret for the years he worked too much and listened too little. Then came the part that hollowed me out. He admitted that when Mark began pushing to take control of the family's story, he hadn't stopped him. He confessed he had agreed to let Mark diminish me, even erase me, because he feared losing his son's loyalty in his final months. He wrote, "I should have defended you. I should have spoken up, but I was tired, and I wanted peace. Forgive me for the silence." I read those words again and again, until the paper blurred with my tears. Forgive me for the silence. I had given my life to that man, carried burdens he never saw, held the household together when he was gone, nursed him when his body betrayed him, and at the end, when his voice could have shielded me, he chose quiet. He chose Mark. The letter slipped from my fingers onto the table. For a long time, I couldn't move. My breath came shallow, my chest tight. I felt betrayed not just by my children, but by the man I had trusted most. The next morning, I forced myself outside. The town was alive with preparations for the exhibit. Trucks unloaded display panels, volunteers carried boxes of pamphlets, and Rebecca stood in the middle of it all, directing like a conductor. Her voice carried, sharp and efficient, making sure every banner was aligned, every spotlight angled just right. I walked past slowly, the letter tucked in my bag, its weight heavier than stone. Rebecca noticed me but didn't falter. She offered a polite nod, the kind you give to a stranger, then turned back to her work. To her, I was already gone. At the grocery store, I overheard two men discussing the event. One said, "Mark's doing a hell of a job. His father raised him right, stood on his own, no nonsense." The other replied, "It's rare to see that kind of family strength these days. Built everything with his bare hands." I wanted to scream. My husband hadn't built it alone. I had been there, shoulder to shoulder, every step of the way. But their words echoed what Mark had planted. The letter in my bag burned hotter. My husband had allowed it. He had handed Mark the match. And now the fire was spreading through every corner of this town. That evening, David came by. He noticed the envelope on the table, the letter still unfolded beside it. He picked it up carefully, his eyes scanning the lines. His face paled. He knew, David whispered. Grandpa knew what Dad was doing, and he let it happen. I nodded, my voice hoarse. He thought silence would keep peace. But silence is what destroyed everything. David looked at me with something close to fear. If this gets out, it could ruin Dad, the campaign, the exhibit, everything. Then maybe it should, I said. He didn't answer. He left soon after, troubled, torn between loyalty and conscience. I watched him go, my heart heavy. He was young, still trapped in the shadow of his father, but I saw the conflict in him. Perhaps one day he would choose differently. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark, the letter before me, the photographs spread across the table. The pieces of my life, my real life, lay scattered, fragile against the machine Mark had built. My husband's final confession cut deeper than anything Mark or Rebecca had done, because it proved I had never truly been defended. Not even by the man who had promised to stand beside me, but the letter also gave me something else, proof, his own words, undeniable, in his handwriting, a weapon I had not expected, placed in my hands by the very man who had once failed me. The next morning, I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. I tucked it into the box with the photographs, the albums, the scraps of truth that remained mine. I no longer felt only grief. I felt something sharper, steadier. They thought they had erased me, but now, I had their cracks. And through those cracks, I would push until the truth shone so brightly it burned their lies to ash. The bills came first, envelopes stacked on the kitchen counter, stamped with red lettering that made my stomach tighten. At first, I assumed they were routine, something I had overlooked in the fog of grief. But as I opened them one by one, the numbers leaped off the page. Withdrawals, transfers, balances drained down to fractions of what I knew should have been there. My retirement fund, the savings I had built through years of steady work, was not just diminished, it was gutted. I sat down hard at the table, spreading the statements out. The dates lined up with the months before my husband passed, when Mark had taken control of so many details to make things easier. The amounts were staggering, pulled in chunks large enough to fund entire projects. And then I noticed where the money had gone. A foundation's name appeared repeatedly, tied to media services, printing companies, event contractors. I recognized the address. It was the same office where Rebecca had been running the exhibit campaign. I gripped the edges of the paper until my hands shook. They hadn't just erased me. They had stolen from me to finance it. The exhibit, the glossy banners, the book Mark was promoting, it was all paid for with the money I had earned. The money meant to carry me through the years, alone. That evening, I confronted Linda again. She opened her door reluctantly, as though expecting me. I placed the bank statement on her kitchen counter. "Did you know?" I asked. Her face flushed. "Mark told me it was Dad's decision. He said Dad wanted the funds used for the project, to honor his memory. Dad couldn't even sign his own name by then," I said, my voice sharp. "And you signed off anyway, didn't you?" Linda's silence told me enough. She fiddled with her necklace, her eyes darting away. Finally, she whispered, "It was supposed to be temporary. Mark said once everything was done, the money would come back, he promised." I laughed then, a bitter sound I hardly recognized as my own. "Promises from your brother are worth less than the paper they're written on." She didn't deny it. She simply looked at me with tired eyes, as though she had made peace with betrayal long before I had. The next day, I went to the bank. The manager, a man who had known me for years, avoided my gaze as he explained the transfers. Mark had secured power of attorney during my husband's illness, authorizing financial decisions on behalf of both of us. With that signature, everything I had saved was siphoned into his projects. I asked, and no one thought to question it. No one thought to ask if I agreed. The manager shifted uncomfortably. It was legal, Mrs. Grant. Everything was in order. Legal. That word sliced deeper than any insult. My life's security had been taken, not by thieves in the night, but by my own blood, with documents and signatures that stripped me bare. I walked out of the bank with the papers in hand, the autumn air biting against my face. On the bulletin board across the street, a poster for the exhibit fluttered in the wind. I stared at it, the glossy surface, the bold slogans, the polished lie, all of it built with my money. I had been forced to fund my own erasure. That night, David stopped by again. His eyes caught the papers spread across the table. He read them quickly, his expression hardening. "He used your savings," David said quietly. "He told me the project was funded by donations, by sponsors, but it was you. It was always you." I nodded. "Every banner, every edited photograph, every speech, it's all mine. Paid with the money I spent a lifetime earning." David clenched his jaw. "Grandma, you have to go public with this." I looked at him, the boy caught between love for his father and loyalty to me. "If I do, I'll destroy him." His voice trembled. "Maybe he deserves it." The next morning, the local paper arrived with a front-page story. "Legacy exhibit to open this weekend." The article praised Mark's dedication, Rebecca's tireless work, the town's pride in a man they called a self-made hero. My name did not appear once, but what struck me most was the line at the end, funded by generous contributions from the Grant family estate. I sat with the paper in my lap, my hands cold. Generous contributions. That was how they spun it. My forced sacrifice had become their noble gesture. I went to the exhibit again, this time during a press tour. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes, and Mark spoke smoothly about legacy, honor, and vision. He gestured to the displays, his voice steady, his image flawless. Rebecca stood at his side, poised, her eyes scanning the crowd with satisfaction. I stood at the back, clutching the envelope with the bank records. When his speech ended, I considered stepping forward, thrusting the truth into the cameras, but I didn't, not yet. The time wasn't right. Instead, I left quietly, my footsteps echoing down the hallway. Outside, the sky was heavy with clouds, the air sharp. I thought of the letter from my husband, his confession of silence. I thought of the photographs altered, my face erased, and now, the savings I had trusted to protect me had been twisted into the very tool that erased me. I realized then that my greatest mistake was not just patience, it was trust. Trust in my husband's silence, trust in my daughter's loyalty, trust in my son's conscience. Trust had left me defenseless, but not anymore. I had proof, now, not just of words, but of money, paper trails, signatures that could not be denied. And when the moment came, I would not be silent. I gathered the bank records, the letter, the photographs, and placed them together in a box. My arsenal, my truth. They thought they had buried me, funded with my own life's work, but I was still standing, and when I chose to speak, my voice would shatter the walls they had built around their lies. The night of the exhibit opening, the town hall glowed like a beacon. Strings of lights draped across the entrance, camera crews hovered near the steps, and a red carpet stretched across the walkway as though the building itself had been transformed into a theater. Guests arrived in their best clothes, voices hushed with reverence, anticipation thick in the air. I stood across the street for a long moment, clutching the small box tucked under my arm, the box holding photographs, bank statements, and the letter that had nearly broken me. Inside, the air was heavy with perfume, polished wood, and the buzz of conversation. Reporters clustered around Mark as he stood in the center of the lobby, his suit impeccable, his smile sharp. Rebecca flanked him, her posture flawless, the perfect partner to his performance. Linda lingered nearby, her hands folded, her face tight with unease. She avoided looking in my direction when I entered. David caught my eye from across the room. He didn't move toward me, but his shoulders eased slightly, as though relieved I had come. I walked slowly, my shoes clicking against the marble floor. The walls glimmered with the false history Mark had created, photographs where my face had been cut out, captions that spoke of a man who had carried his family single-handedly, exhibits funded by the very money stolen from me. Guests admired the displays, pointing, murmuring, nodding in approval. Not one questioned what was missing. Mark raised his hands, and the room quieted. His voice filled the hall, rich and confident. Tonight, we honor a man who built not only a family but a community. A man whose vision shaped us all. My father. Applause broke out, warm and generous. Cameras flashed, pens scribbled. Mark basked in the glow, his words smooth, his image untouchable. He continued, weaving a story of resilience, sacrifice, triumph. My husband became a legend before my eyes, a figure sculpted from lies and omissions. I felt the box under my arm grow heavier. Then Mark gestured to a podium at the front, where a microphone stood waiting. It is my honor to welcome you to the Legacy exhibit. May we carry forward the lessons he taught us, the strength he embodied. The applause swelled again. He stepped back, Rebecca beaming at his side. And that was the moment I moved forward. Gasps rippled through the crowd as I walked to the podium. Some whispered my name, others frowned in confusion. Mark's smile faltered, Rebecca stiffened, and Linda froze where she stood. David took a small step toward me, though he stopped short. Torn, I placed the box on the podium and looked out at the crowd. My voice was steady. You've heard one version of my husband's life. You've seen the exhibits, the photographs, the banners. But there is another truth you deserve to know. Mark was already moving toward me, his hand raised as if to stop me, but I spoke louder, my words echoing through the hall. For 50 years, I stood beside him. I carried as much as he did, sometimes more. I was his partner, his equal. Yet tonight, you see a history where I do not exist. Ask yourselves, why? Murmurs spread quickly. Eyes darted between me and Mark, uncertainty flickering. I opened the box and pulled out the first item, a photograph. The real version, unedited, showing me seated at Mark's graduation, my hand on his shoulder, pride on my face. I held it high. This is the truth. This is what was taken from you. Gasps echoed again. Guests craned their necks, recognizing the difference between what hung on the walls and what I held in my hand. I laid the photo on the podium and pulled out the next piece, the bank statements. And this is how the exhibit you admired tonight was funded. Not by donations, not by sponsors, by my retirement savings, by the money I earned, stolen under the guise of honoring a man's life. Voices rose, sharp, confused, angry. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras whirred. Mark reached the podium then, his face taut with anger. Mother, this isn't the time. It is exactly the time. I cut in, my voice firm. I pulled the last item from the box, the letter, my husband's handwriting across the page. And this is his truth. He admitted it himself. He let them erase me because he was afraid of losing his son. He asked for forgiveness, but silence cannot be forgiven when it destroys a life. The room fell silent, the weight of the words hanging heavy. I unfolded the letter, reading aloud the line that had carved me open. I should have defended you. I should have spoken up. Forgive me for the silence. I lowered the paper slowly. This is not about bitterness. This is about truth. I was there. I will not be erased. Not by my son, not by his wife, not by anyone who prefers a cleaner story over a true one. The crowd erupted into chaos. Questions shouted, voices overlapping, some defending, others condemning. Mark stood rigid, his jaw clenched, unable to silence the wave now rising against him. Rebecca's mask slipped, her composure cracking as whispers turned to accusations. Linda shrank back, her face pale, guilt etched across her features. I stepped away from the podium, the box now empty but my presence undeniable. I had given them the evidence, the words, the images. Whether they chose to believe or not was beyond my control, but I had spoken, and the silence that had bound me for so long was broken. As I walked through the crowd, people parted around me, some touching my arm gently, others avoiding my eyes. David caught up to me near the exit, his expression raw. He whispered, "You did it." I shook my head. No, I only told the truth. What they do with it is up to them. Outside, the night air hit me sharp and clean. Behind me, the town hall buzzed with noise, the foundation of Mark's carefully built story cracking under the weight of reality. For the first time in months, I lifted my head high. They had tried to erase me. Tonight, I made sure they never could again. The morning after I spoke at the exhibit, the town was no longer the same. The story that Mark and Rebecca had polished for months cracked open overnight. The local paper ran headlines, not about my husband's legacy, but about financial mismanagement, altered photographs, and a letter that raised more questions than it answered. The radio stations replayed snippets of my speech, my voice steady and sharp, while callers debated whether Mark had betrayed not only his mother but the community itself. At the grocery store, whispers followed me again, but this time they carried a different weight. Some nodded quietly as I passed. Others stepped forward to say, "We didn't know. We should have." Their words did not erase the pain, but they carved space for me in a world where I had been erased. Mark tried to push back. He called the reports slander, claimed I had been manipulated, suggested grief had clouded my memory. Rebecca held press conferences with carefully chosen words, denying financial impropriety, insisting the edits to the photographs were artistic adjustments. But the town had seen too much. The evidence I had laid bare was undeniable. Soon after, the board overseeing Mark's campaign announced they were suspending their support. Sponsors for the exhibit pulled out, embarrassed to be tied to scandal. His polished image, once untouchable, frayed under the weight of truth. Rebecca disappeared from public view, her presence reduced to whispers of blame behind closed doors. Linda came to me days later, her face pale, her hands trembling. She begged for forgiveness, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I thought I had no choice," she said. "I thought siding with Mark was the only way to keep my children secure." I listened, but I did not comfort her. "Every choice has a cost," I told her. "You paid with your integrity, I paid with my life. Only one of us can recover what was lost." She wept harder, but I did not weep with her. David remained the only one who stood with me openly. He visited often, helped me sort through the photographs, insisted that someday people would understand what I had done. "You changed it, Grandma," he said once. "You showed them the truth when no one else could." But I knew it was not about changing them. It was about reclaiming myself. The final act of closure came at the church. Pastor John, who had stood silent for too long, invited me to speak at a Sunday service. I stood before the congregation, the same place where Mark had silenced me at the funeral, and this time I spoke freely. I told them what silence does, how it erases not just words but lives. I told them that truth is not always neat, not always polished, but it deserves to be carried forward as it is, not as others wish it to be. When I finished, the congregation stood. Not all clapped, not all agreed, but they looked at me, not through me, not around me, but at me, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, I made peace with the fact that my husband would never defend me, that my daughter had chosen convenience over loyalty, that my son had tried to bury me under the weight of his ambition. What mattered was that I had spoken, what mattered was that I had not let them succeed. Now, as I sit in my home, the photographs restored, the letter folded carefully in its envelope, I look back on the path I walked. For most of my life, I believed patience was strength. I thought endurance was dignity, that if I stayed quiet, truth would eventually speak for itself. But I learned that silence is not neutral, it is permission. It allows others to carve your story without you. It allows lies to become fact, erasures to become permanent. My husband's silence cost me my place. My own silence nearly did the same. I have no illusions left. Family will betray you if it suits them. Even children you raised with everything you had. Communities will believe the version that is easiest to swallow. Money you saved can be taken with a single signature. None of these things are guarantees. The only guarantee is your own voice. If you choose to use it, that is the lesson I carry now. If you are silent, you will vanish. If you speak, you might still lose, but at least you will exist. So to anyone listening who has been pushed aside, erased, or told they do not belong, do not wait for someone else to defend you. Do not expect gratitude to come where it has never lived. Speak, even if your voice shakes, even if you stand alone, because once you claim your truth, no one can take it from you. I am Evelyn Grant. They tried to erase me, but I am still here, and so are you. If this story found you, stay with me for the next one. There are more voices that need to be heard. Subscribe, so none of us stand in silence again.